August 21st, 1986. Somewhere in northwestern Cameroon, thousands of people went to sleep at the same time. No screams, no panic, no warning, and when the sun rose the next morning, even the birds didn't wake up, because whatever passed through that valley during the night didn't make a sound. Families were found exactly where they had fallen asleep, parents in their beds, children on the floor, livestock frozen in place, as if time itself had stopped. There were no signs of struggle, no wounds, no fires, just silence. At first, people thought it was a chemical attack. Others whispered about curses. Some believed the land itself had turned against them. But the truth was far stranger and far more terrifying, because that night, a lake exploded, without fire, without lava, without sound, and in less than an hour, it released something invisible, something heavier than air, something that moved downhill like a living thing. This is the story of Lake Nyos, a place where nature didn't roar, it whispered, and thousands died listening. And by the end of this video, you'll understand how a perfectly calm lake turned into one of the deadliest natural disasters in human history without a single person realizing what was happening until it was already over. To understand why this disaster caught everyone off guard, we first need to understand where Lake Nyos actually is, and more importantly, what kind of place it really was. Lake Nyos sits in northwestern Cameroon, far from major cities, far from global attention, and far from anything most people would ever describe as dangerous. To the locals, this wasn't a cursed place. It wasn't forbidden ground. It was just a lake, calm, quiet, almost beautiful. Nyos is what scientists call a crater lake, formed thousands of years ago when volcanic activity collapsed inward, leaving behind a deep bowl that slowly filled with rainwater. But here's the part that matters. This volcano was considered inactive. No smoke, no lava, no tremors anyone could feel, which meant no alarms, no evacuation plans, and absolutely no reason for the surrounding villagers to believe they were living next to a silent threat. The region itself was rural and deeply agricultural. Families raised cattle, children walked barefoot between villages. Life followed patterns, seasons, rainfall, harvests, and Nyos Lake fit perfectly into that rhythm. During the rainy season, the lake would swell slightly. During drier months it would retreat. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming. Even scientists had little reason to pay attention. Yes, the area was part of a volcanic line. Yes, there had been activity thousands of years ago, but in human terms, it was ancient history. And that assumption that something quiet is something safe turned out to be the deadliest mistake of all, because while the surface of Lake Nyos looked peaceful, something entirely different was happening below. The lake was unusually deep, more than 200 meters in some places, and deep water behaves differently than shallow water. At those depths, pressure increases, temperatures stabilize, layers stop mixing, which meant whatever entered the bottom of that lake stayed there for years, decades, even longer. No one could see it, no one could smell it, and no one had a reason to ask the right questions, because nothing like this had ever happened before. Lake Nyos wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it was patient, and while people lived their lives above it, the lake was quietly becoming something else entirely, a sealed container, slowly filling with pressure, waiting for a single moment that would turn calm water into a killing force. What no one could see on the surface of Lake Nyos was the slow, invisible process happening far below it. Beneath the lake, deep underground, sat something that had never truly gone away, a pocket of magma, not erupting, not moving, just hot enough to keep releasing gas, carbon dioxide. Over time, that gas didn't escape into the air. It didn't bubble up dramatically. Instead, it leaked quietly into the deepest parts of the lake, where pressure was highest and movement was almost non-existent. And here's where the science becomes deadly. Water under pressure can hold gas, just like a sealed soda bottle. Shake it, and nothing happens until you open the cap. Lake Nyos was doing the same thing. The deeper the water, the more pressure it created, and the more pressure there was, the more carbon dioxide the water could trap. Year after year, the bottom layers of the lake absorbed more and more gas. No bubbles, no warning signs. Because the lake was stratified, that means its layers didn't mix. Warm water stayed near the top, cold, dense water stayed below, and the gas stayed locked in the deepest layer, compressed, silent, Waiting, scientists later described Lake Nyos as a sealed container, slowly filling with pressure, and unlike volcanoes or earthquakes, there was no obvious signal that anything was wrong. No smoke, no shaking ground, no rising temperature. Even if someone had stood right at the edge of the lake that night, they would have seen nothing unusual at all. But deep below the surface, the concentration of carbon dioxide had reached a critical point. Under normal conditions, carbon dioxide makes up about 4% of the air we breathe. At 10%, humans lose consciousness. At 15%, death can occur in seconds. Inside the lake, the gas pressure had reached levels far beyond what life could tolerate. And the most terrifying part, the system was stable. Until it wasn't. All it needed was a single disturbance, a landslide, a sudden movement of water, heavy rain cooling the surface, or even a minor shift beneath the lake bed. Any one of these could have caused the deep gas-rich water to rise toward the surface, and once that process started, it would feed itself. As the water rose, pressure dropped. As pressure dropped, gas escaped. As gas escaped, the water became lighter and rose even faster. A chain reaction, what scientists call a limnic eruption, not an explosion of fire, but an explosion of gas. And when that gas finally broke free, it didn't rush upward like steam. Carbon dioxide is heavier than air, so instead of rising, it spilled over the edge of the lake and flowed downhill, like fog, like a slow-moving wave, invisible, silent, and impossible to outrun. By the time the first breath was taken, the disaster had already begun. August 21st, 1986 didn't begin like a disaster. It was an ordinary evening. The sun went down, cooking fires burned low, families settled into their homes across the valleys surrounding Lake Nyos. There were no warnings from the sky, no tremors underfoot, and no reason for anyone to stay awake. Sometime after nightfall, a few people reported hearing a strange sound, not an explosion, not thunder, more like a deep, distant rumble, brief and easy to ignore. In a region where storms were common and landslides weren't unusual, no one thought twice about it. Most people went to sleep, and while the villagers fell quiet, something changed at the lake. Scientists still debate the exact trigger. One theory suggests a landslide slipped into the water, disturbing the delicate balance holding the gas below. Another suggests cold rain cooled the surface just enough to send denser water sinking downward, forcing the gas-rich layers to rise. Some even believe a minor volcanic disturbance occurred beneath the lake bed, too small to be felt, but enough to start the chain reaction. Whatever the cause, the moment it began, it couldn't be stopped. Deep water surged upward, pressure dropped, and in seconds, carbon dioxide burst out of the water, not as a flame, not as smoke, but as a massive, invisible cloud. Witnesses later described the lake behaving strangely, water rising, foam forming on the surface, and then silence. No shockwave, no blast, just gas. An estimated hundreds of thousands of tons of carbon dioxide poured out of Lake Nyos in less than an hour. And because carbon dioxide is heavier than air, it didn't rise into the sky. It spilled over the edge of the lake and followed the land, downhill, through valleys, straight toward the sleeping villagers below. The cloud moved fast. Some estimates suggest up to 100 kilometers per hour in open areas, and slow enough in others to pool and linger like fog. It hugged the ground, filled homes, slipped through doors and windows, and where it passed, oxygen vanished. People didn't wake up screaming. Carbon dioxide doesn't burn the lungs. It doesn't trigger pain. It simply replaces the air. One breath, then another, and within seconds, consciousness faded. Entire families lost their lives in their sleep. Cattle collapsed in fields. Birds fell silent. In some places, the gas layer was estimated to be more than 50 meters thick. Anyone sleeping at ground level stood no chance, but those on higher ground, even just a few meters up, sometimes survived without ever understanding why. By the time the cloud finally dispersed, the valleys around Lake Nyos had become something else entirely, a place where life had simply stopped, and no one yet knew what had caused it. The cloud didn't arrive like a storm. There was no wind announcing it, no sound warning the villagers below. It simply appeared. Flowing down the slopes surrounding Lake Nyos, the carbon dioxide hugged the ground, moving the way heavy fog does, but far more deadly. In the lowest parts of the valleys, the gas collected quickly. Homes built close to the ground filled first. Inside, entire families were asleep. There was no burning sensation, no choking, no panic response from the body. Carbon dioxide doesn't attack the lungs, it replaces oxygen. One breath felt normal, the next caused dizziness, and before the brain could register danger, consciousness slipped away. People collapsed exactly where they were, in beds, on mats, by doorways. Some were found sitting upright, as if they had simply fallen asleep, mid-movement. Outside, livestock began to drop almost immediately. Cattle collapsed in fields. Goats fell where they stood. Even insects, flies, mosquitoes, vanished from the air. Later, survivors would say something felt wrong, not because of what they heard, but because of what they didn't. No animal sounds, no night insects, absolute silence. In some areas, the gas layer reached heights of over 50 meters, thick enough to cover entire villages. And because carbon dioxide is heavier than air, it didn't disperse quickly. It lingered. Pools of invisible death settled into low-lying areas and stayed there for hours. Anyone who entered those zones, rescuers, family members, neighbors, risked collapsing within seconds. Some people survived purely by accident, those sleeping on elevated ground, those who happened to be standing when the gas arrived, those who ran uphill without understanding why. They didn't outrun the cloud, they simply rose above it. By the time dawn approached, the gas slowly thinned, oxygen returned, and the valleys revealed what the night had taken. Fried entire villages were gone. In some homes, every single person had died. In others, one survivor remained, often the only one who had slept on a raised surface or left the house during the night. When rescuers finally began moving through the area, they described the scene as unnatural. Bodies showed no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no burns, just stillness. Even days later, there were no insects around the dead. The ecosystem itself had been wiped clean, stripped of oxygen in a matter of minutes. In total, more than 1,700 people lost their lives. Over 3,500 animals died alongside them. And for hours after the event, no one could explain how an entire population could disappear without fire, without violence, without a sound. The deadliest part of the disaster wasn't the gas itself. It was the fact that no one ever knew it was there. Morning came slowly to the valleys around Lake Nyos. For those who survived the night, it didn't arrive with light, it arrived with confusion. Some people woke up on the ground, unable to move, unsure how they had gotten there. Others woke to a silence so complete it felt unnatural. No animals, no insects, just still air and bodies. Survivors later described trying to stand, only to collapse again, their muscles weak, their lungs burning, their thoughts fragmented. Many didn't immediately understand that everyone around them was dead. Some assumed their families were still asleep. They called out, no answer. One survivor described walking through his village and realizing something was wrong, not because of what he saw, but because there were no flies on the bodies. In a rural environment, that should have been impossible. Others noticed strange physical symptoms, burns on their skin, lesions that looked like pressure wounds. Some vomited repeatedly. Many reported dizziness, headaches, and vivid hallucinations, including smells that weren't actually there. The human brain, starved of oxygen, had begun misfiring. In several villages, a single person survived, while dozens of relatives did not. Entire families erased overnight, leaving behind one confused witness, struggling to understand why they were still alive. Rescue didn't come immediately. People who entered the valleys too soon collapsed themselves. Some rescuers lost consciousness just a few steps into the affected areas and had to be dragged back uphill. Word spread slowly. Something was wrong, but no one knew what. By the time medical teams arrived, the scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. Survivors were transported to hospitals with symptoms doctors struggled to classify. At first, chemical poisoning was suspected, then biological contamination. Even volcanic gases were considered, but none fit the pattern completely. Autopsies revealed something unsettling. Most victims showed no signs of trauma, no internal injuries, no burns to the airways. Instead, they had simply lost consciousness and never regained it. Oxygen deprivation, asphyxiation, not from smoke or fire, but from an invisible absence of air. Survivors often described guilt, not because they had done something wrong, but because survival itself felt arbitrary. They had slept on a raised surface. They had stood up at the right moment. They had walked uphill without knowing why. Small differences, measured in meters, had separated life from death. And as the days passed, the question that haunted everyone remained unanswered. What could wipe out entire villages without leaving a mark? When scientists finally arrived at Lake Nyos, they weren't looking for a lake. They were looking for a weapon. At first, many believed the event had been caused by a chemical release. Others suspected a volcanic gas eruption, something similar to what had happened near active volcanoes in the past. But Lake Nyos didn't fit those patterns. There were no burns, no acidic damage to vegetation, and no signs of explosive force. What investigators did find was something far stranger. The lake had changed color. Water that was normally deep blue had turned a dark, rusty red. That color shift told scientists something important. Iron-rich water from the bottom of the lake had been violently pushed to the surface, something that should have been impossible, without a massive vertical disturbance. Measurements taken in the following days revealed extreme levels of dissolved carbon dioxide still trapped in the lake's deeper layers. In some places, concentrations were hundreds of times higher than what would ever be considered safe. The conclusion became unavoidable. Lake Nyos had suffered a limnic eruption, a phenomenon so rare it was barely understood at the time. Scientists realized that the lake itself had acted like a pressure vessel. Over decades, carbon dioxide from underground magma had quietly dissolved into the deep water, and when the balance was disturbed, the system collapsed in on itself. Once the gas began to rise, it accelerated its own release, a runaway reaction that could not be stopped. What shocked researchers most wasn't just what happened, but how close the world had come to not understanding it at all. Before Lake Nyos, limnic eruptions were largely theoretical. They existed in academic papers, not in real-world disaster plans. This meant there were no warning systems, no sensors, no evacuation protocols. The people living around the lake had never been told they were at risk because no one knew they were. As data continued to come in, scientists began to model what had happened minute by minute. The numbers were staggering: hundreds of thousands of tons of carbon dioxide released in less than an hour, a gas cloud dense enough to push oxygen completely out of the valleys below. And one final realization settled in: Lake Nyos was not unique. Other deep volcanic lakes existed around the world, quiet, calm, and seemingly harmless. If this had happened once, it could happen again. After Lake Nyos, one terrifying question refused to go away. Was this a one-time anomaly or a warning? Scientists began looking beyond Cameroon. They searched for other lakes with the same deadly conditions: deep water, volcanic activity below, and long-term gas buildup. What they found was unsettling. Lake Nyos wasn't alone. Just 2 years before the Nyos disaster, another lake in Cameroon, Lake Manoun, had released carbon dioxide, killing dozens of people. At the time, the event had been treated as an isolated tragedy. After Nyos, it was reclassified as a warning sign. But the most alarming discovery lay even farther away. On the border between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda sits Lake Kivu, one of the largest and deepest lakes in Africa. Unlike Nyos, Lake Kivu is surrounded by millions of people, and beneath its surface, enormous quantities of dissolved gases, including carbon dioxide and methane, are trapped under pressure. Some estimates suggest Lake Kivu holds thousands of times more gas than Lake Nyos ever did. A sudden release there would not affect a few villages. It could impact entire cities. Scientists debate the likelihood. Some believe the lake is stable, its gas layers held in balance. Others warn that earthquakes, volcanic activity, or even human interference could disrupt that balance. What makes these lakes so dangerous is how normal they appear. No smoke, no heat, no visible threat. They sit quietly, reflecting the sky, while storing forces capable of wiping out life below them. Lake Nyos changed how scientists think about natural disasters. It proved that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes the most lethal threats are the ones that look peaceful, right up until they're not. And somewhere in the world today, there are lakes just like Nyos, calm on the surface, unstable below, waiting for a trigger. No one can predict. After the truth about Lake Nyos became clear, scientists faced a new problem. The disaster wasn't over. The lake was still there, and deep beneath its surface, large amounts of carbon dioxide remained trapped. Another release, even a smaller one, could be just as deadly. But how do you neutralize a lake? Draining it wasn't an option. Explosives were unthinkable, and doing nothing meant accepting that the same tragedy could happen again. The solution scientists proposed sounded almost too simple. Slowly remove the gas, not all at once, not violently, but gradually, in a way that would never allow pressure to build again. Engineers designed a system of long vertical pipes, anchored deep into the lake's bottom. At first, pumps were used to bring gas-rich water to the surface. As the water rose, pressure dropped, and carbon dioxide escaped safely into the air. Eventually, the system reached a point where it no longer needed pumps at all. The gas itself powered the process. Once started, the rising water created a self-sustaining flow, continuously releasing carbon dioxide in controlled, harmless amounts. By the early 2000s, the first permanent degassing pipe was installed in Lake Nyos. More followed years later. Slowly, the pressure inside the lake began to drop. Monitoring systems were added. Scientists measured gas levels, water chemistry, and seismic activity around the lake. The immediate threat decreased, but it never disappeared completely. One major concern remains. Lake Nyos is held back by a natural volcanic dam. Over time, erosion has weakened it. If that wall were to collapse, millions of cubic meters of water could rush downstream, carrying gas with it toward villages and even across national borders. Reinforcing the dam is possible, but expensive and technically complex. So for now, Lake Nyos exists in a delicate balance, partially disarmed, carefully monitored, and never fully trusted, a reminder that some natural forces can be managed, but never completely controlled. Lake Nyos no longer looks dangerous. The water is calm, the hills are green again, and on the surface, there is nothing to suggest that this place once took thousands of lives in a single night. That's what makes the story so unsettling. There was no monster, no explosion, no warning sirens, just a quiet chain of natural processes that aligned at the worst possible moment. The people living near Lake Nyos didn't ignore signs. There were no signs to ignore. They trusted what they could see, and what they saw was a peaceful lake that had always been there. Nyos changed how we understand danger. It reminded scientists that nature doesn't always announce itself with fire or noise. Sometimes it waits. It stores energy slowly, and when it finally releases it, the damage is already done before anyone realizes what's happening. Today, the lake is monitored, its gas levels are measured, its walls are watched. Technology stands guard where ignorance once stood, but even now, Lake Nyos is not considered completely safe, because safety in this case doesn't mean elimination, it means management, and management requires attention, memory, and respect for forces we don't fully control. The legacy of Lake Nyos isn't just the lives it took, it's the lesson it left behind, that the most dangerous threats are sometimes invisible, that silence doesn't mean absence, and that understanding the world around us can be the difference between sleeping peacefully and never waking up at all.